Carmichael is the Robert C. Fleurer Professor of Civil War Studies and the director of the Civil War Institute at Gettysburg College. He has published a number of books, most recently a study of Southern college students during the Civil War era, entitled The Last Generation, Young Virginians in Peace, War, and Reunion. He's working on The War for the Common Soldier, which will be part of the University of North Carolina Press's Littlefield History of the Civil War series. It explores how ordinary men understood the war through emotion, thought, and action, and how these figured into resistance to military authority. Pete is also exploring gender and race issues in a concurrent project titled I Am a Man, African American Freedom Struggles in the 19th Century South. He served as Gettysburg National Military Park's first scholar in residence in 1999 and currently serves as an Organization of American Historians Distinguished Lecturer, conducting public presentations, teacher workshops, and consulting on exhibits. And yet once again, I am pleased to say that he is a board member of the Gettysburg Foundation, which we are very proud of. So please welcome Dr. Pete Carmichael.
Joanne, thank you so much. You can't say enough good things about what the Foundation does here. As many of you know, the National Park Service is enduring strained budgets. Many of the educational activities that they do are very difficult for them to execute now. If it wasn't for the good work of the Foundation and their staff, a lot of these programs, including this, just simply would not be possible at all. So I'm very honored to be here, happy to see a full house, especially after the James McPherson talk. I was expecting a mass exodus out of the tent, and I would be hearing crickets right now. So I thank you for sticking around. And this evening, or this afternoon, I'm going to talk about the issue of cowardice. And I should tell you the title of the talk, which we haven't heard, Born to Run. Born to Run. After receiving his parole as an exchange prisoner of war in Indianapolis, William Nixon began an 18-day journey that ended on the outskirts of Gettysburg, just as the sun was setting on the evening of July the 1st. Unarmed, when he reached his regiment, the 14th Indiana, he was told by an orderly that there wasn't a gun to be found. Early the next morning, and still without a weapon, he accompanied his regiment to a reserve position probably not far from here, just a few hundred yards behind Cemetery Ridge. A random Confederate shell exploded occasionally, prompting Nixon to turn to the orderly, and he asked what he should do. I don't know, the orderly reportedly said, but stay with the company as long as you can. The words, as long as you can, were interpreted as a discretionary order by Nixon. He was puzzled why no one had given him instructions about securing a gun, and so as soon as the regiment headed towards Cemetery Hill, Nixon headed to the rear with the brigade band. For the remainder of July 2nd and then the next day, July the 3rd, he claimed that he came under an intense artillery fire while he was trying to care for the wounded. On July 4th, he headed to the 2nd Corps Field Hospital before returning to his regiment. 3 days later, the lieutenant colonel of the 14th Indiana preferred charges against Nixon for misbehavior before the enemy. Now, the story of William Nixon is not the story of Henry Fleming, the fictionalized character in Stephen Crane's classic Red Badge of Courage. Now, a little side note here. This is a moment for self-congratulation for me. The first time I ever referenced Stephen Crane's book, it was in front of an audience at the University of Virginia. I was a young graduate student, and instead of saying Stephen Crane, I said Stephen King's classic. So I'm 2 for 2 here, Al. I gave this a similar talk a few weeks ago, so I got it right this time. So Nixon's story is nothing like the story of Henry Fleming. There was no mad and confused rush from the field, no cursing officers wielding swords against fleeing soldiers. There's no sense of fear pervading the scene. In fact, Nixon's regiment wasn't even engaged when he slipped away from the ranks. He lacked a gun and simply decided to follow the brigade band around the field. Now, were there incidents of mass panic at Gettysburg or examples of individual soldiers who went limp in the face of enemy fire? Of course. 11th Corps, madly racing through the town of Gettysburg on the evening of July the 1st, is the image that usually comes to mind. The stampede of O.O. Howard's men encapsulates how we imagine that moment of upheaval, when all's torn loose from human control, when armies disintegrated under the madness of fighting and self-preservation, and when soldiers cared not for the man who was standing next to them, but only for self-preservation. But the act of cowardice cannot always be described as a frenzied response to the terrors of combat. It was a spontaneous moment, to be sure, but it was often acted out with careful deliberation. Any man who fled from the ranks in plain view of his comrades was likely doomed before the rough justice of a military court-martial. Worst of all, a soldier would have to endure the irretrievable loss of reputation before comrades and community. The risk of getting caught, they're just too great, and the punishments too damning for any man not to be calculating when deserting the battlefield. So, how did soldiers slip away from the ranks without drawing the immediate attention of their officers or running afoul the military justice system? Timing was everything if a soldier, a deserting soldier, was to be successful. Men purposely banished from their regiments just on the eve of battle. If in fact a man did that, it was very difficult to charge a soldier with misbehavior before the enemy. Can't charge him with that if the enemy is not within the line of sight. So it fell upon the courts, the military courts, to determine the boundaries of the battlefield. But it became apparent really quickly that people could not agree upon what constituted the true killing fields of war. If the men could hear the firing and see the smoke, were they actually on the battlefield? Or were they still behind the lines? If walking wounded were encountered, were they caught in the liminal space between the front and the rear? If stray bullets whizzed overhead or a shell occasionally exploded, had that physical area become a combat zone? These were critical questions in the prosecution of cowardice, and the answers were never clear-cut and they were never consistent. As hard as the military justice system tried to reduce cowardice to a black and white matter, these cases existed in the murky gray area of war. Time and time again, a man charged with cowardice was able to preserve the veneer of having done his duty even as he violated military protocol. Soldiers accomplished this by using their bodies as weapons of deception. A man who claimed that he was broken down, that he could not keep pace with his regiment, that he was overcome by illness, he could easily turn his ailment into a medical mystery that neither doctors or officers could diagnose. Long after the war, and I've seen this time and time again, veterans, they were struck by how epidemics of diarrhea, epidemics of constipation, epidemics of rheumatism would suddenly sweep through the ranks just as the battle started. Court-martial records at the National Archives, they abound with incidents of men accused of faking an illness or just simply having a long history of getting sick on the eve of a battle. One such case is the story of Lieutenant George Gillis of the 77th New York Infantry. He had been under suspicion for missing the Battle of Chancellorsville. At Gettysburg, he was charged with being absent without leave. Gillis, his defense was that he claimed he had severe ulcers on his legs, which made him unfit for duty. And so for much of July 2nd, he simply wasn't able to keep up with his regiment. When he did, he was either riding a horse or he was in an ambulance. Suddenly, and within a few miles of the Gettysburg battlefield, he disappeared while the men were making their coffee. During the subsequent court-martial, witnesses testified that they could see the smoke from the battlefield and they could hear the boom of the cannon during their coffee break. The court was clearly trying to establish that the approaching storm of battle, with all of its impending fury, had caused Gillis to run for cover. Or perhaps the storm had already broken and Gillis simply ran as soon as he felt endangered. The curious timing of his departure and a long history of becoming invisible when the shooting started was the court's accusatory angle. But the prosecution's line of attack was blunted by a certificate of disability. After Gillis had left his regiment, stumbled behind the lines, he ran into a surgeon examined him, and the surgeon concluded, how about that? Pretty nice catch there. Pretty coordinated for an academic, wouldn't you say? The doctor, when he examined him, he saw that the ulcer was so severe that he said that he was not fit to stay in the ranks. In fact, the doctor also diagnosed him with having diarrhea. Suspicions about Gillis, it must have lingered with the court. But the peculiar circumstances did not matter because Gillis had what? A certificate of disability from that surgeon. All the suspicions were absolutely irrelevant. This certificate of disability, as you can imagine, it was highly coveted in the ranks. It was seen as a get out from combat for free card. Now, it's impossible to say whether this was Gillis's design, but it certainly was the scheme of many. And by the time of Gettysburg, as you might imagine, surgeons, they'd become veterans, they had become hardened, and they had become much less likely to hand out these certificates of disability. So this invention of health problems through bodily disguise, it vexed Civil War doctors until the end of the war. And the ruses of malingerers, these men were often called, I might add, deadbeats. They were elaborate and they were endlessly creative. Ready? Some men inserted an onion into their rectums. An hour later, when standing at sick call, their faces were flushed and their pulses accelerated. It was also common for soldiers to have a brown, furred tongue after chewing on a cartridge of gunpowder, and then rinsing their mouth with vinegar. Upon examination, many surgeons mistakenly concluded that the soldier was suffering from a dysfunctional thyroid. Some men took to swallowing small pieces of tobacco, and of course that induced a predictable fit of vomiting, leaving the man absolutely unfit for duty. In the Confederate Army, there were examples of soldiers cutting the insides of their mouth so that they would spit blood. There were also reports of soldiers stealing the stool samples of other patients to claim that, of course, they were suffering from diarrhea. These tactics of malingerers had two critical consequences. First, it exploded the idea that cowardice only took place on the battlefield. And second, their masquerades demonstrated how difficult it would be for doctors and officers to expose shirkers. Now, this is a critical point. 1861, war begins. Northerners and Southerners are in absolute agreement about one thing, that cowardice was a choice. It was a choice that signified a crisis of morale. It was a choice that revealed a lack of character. And it was a choice that ultimately demonstrated an intrinsic loss of being a man. When a soldier failed to do his duty, culpability always, and I mean always, resided with the individual. Circumstances didn't mean a thing. Conversely, courage was seen as an indisputable statement of willed behavior and character. So, you're considered or damned as a malingerer or a coward. You were seen as a man who lacked morals and a man who was ultimately responsible for his nervousness under fire. The idea was that fear overtook the weak, causing them to lose control in battle, but then to ultimately do what? To lie and deceive by what they had actually done in combat. So, Americans, they looked to the battlefield after Fort Sumter as this commanding stage, and it would be a commanding stage where soldiers could live the role of the fearless warrior. When the curtains closed, house lights came on, no soldier imagined that the act of killing would have to be interpreted. A man acted either with courage or he did what? He exited the stage as a coward. But combat, as we all know, it's never a morality play, is it? In which performances are perfectly scripted in favor of the courageous. All was lost in the chaos when the shooting began. Its sounds were hellish. Its violence utterly disorienting. Its smells sickening. Battlefield destabilized reality, making it nearly impossible for two people to agree upon what they had just witnessed or what they had experienced. I'll turn to the case now of Captain Thomas Rogers of the 140th Pennsylvania. Evan Rothera, he is a graduate of Gettysburg College. He's now getting his PhD at Penn State. He and I have worked on some of the research, and I am drawing from some of his analysis. I should add that these case studies that I've given you, they are part of a book that will be published, I hope, in about 2 years, entitled Cowardice at Gettysburg, based entirely upon case studies from the National Archives and case studies that my students at Gettysburg College have done. They've worked on these during their senior seminar. There's a lot of advantages of going to Gettysburg College, and of course, pretty significant ones. If you're a student interested in the Civil War, you have this wonderful battlefield in which to do research and to explore, and you've got the National Archives just down the road in Washington, D.C. My students during their senior seminar, they dug into these very rich cases, and I'm about to give you one of them, again, of Thomas Rogers. So, this is, again, an important example because it reveals how nobody could draw established truths from combat. During the fighting, the 140th Pennsylvania made one of the counterattacks through the wheat field. They recaptured the stony field before a Confederate counterattack slammed into their flank. That counterattack was led by Wofford's Georgians. Many of these Pennsylvanians, they refused to surrender. They actually had to cut their way out to safety before running a gauntlet of fire. But one man who did not escape, was Rogers. Confederates captured him, and for this, 2 charges: misbehavior before the enemy and allowing himself to be captured. Very serious charges. Now, 3 witnesses were called against Rogers. One claimed that the captain was 75 yards behind the regiment, hiding behind a large rock near a belt of woods. A second said that he didn't see Rogers anywhere on the field until he was captured. And a third claimed that Rogers was sitting on his knee with some Confederate prisoners and that he was hiding behind a rock. Now, from the prosecution's perspective, this is very, very challenging because the testimony was deeply inconsistent. The 3 men could not agree on critical points. One soldier had Rogers behind a rock. Another saw him behind the regiment. 2 men never saw the captain with Confederate prisoners. And one man admitted that he had never seen Rogers during the actual fighting. Now, when Rogers, he was given an opportunity to cross-examine, he asked the man pointedly, "Did you see me on the field?" And the man said, that the smoke was so dense and the boulders so thick that he actually couldn't see very far at all. Another soldier confessed that he wasn't certain of the distance between the regiment's firing line and the rock where Rogers supposedly used for shelter. So Rogers countered. He said, look, these charges are false, and these charges, they're spawned by fellow officers who are jealous of my promotion. He proceeded, Rogers did, to bring in a series of witnesses who could attest to his bravery. First one, Corporal George Rose, placed Rogers at the front of his regiment. You had your sword drawn and said, keep cool, boys, and fire low, Rose stated. You had first come along the line and was standing in the rear of our company. The company was firing at the time. Private William Griggs also saw Rogers at the front of his regiment without showing a hint of fear. You were right in the rear of the regiment. You had your sword drawn and was telling the boys to go ahead, to keep cool, fire low, that we were driving them like hell. The regiment was firing at the time. You went as far as we men. Private Hugh Shaw offered the most heroic depiction of Rogers. You were kneeling down on your knees when a rebel sergeant came up and ordered you to throw down your saber. You replied, you would not surrender your saber to a private. The sergeant said he would run you through with his bayonet if you did not surrender. You replied, you did not care a damn, but you would not give your sword to any man but an officer. This tense moment thankfully came to an end, Private Shaw recounted, when the Confederate took Rogers to his officer so he could properly surrender his sword. Unlike the witnesses for the prosecution, who charged Rogers with cowardly behavior for hiding behind the rock, the witnesses for the defense, they insisted that Rogers was in the midst of his unit, right on the firing line, cheering his men forward before manfully surrendering to hordes of attacking Confederates. Reconciling these divergent accounts is absolutely impossible, but here is the point. Think how maddening it must have been for Civil War soldiers to draw any hard truths from combat. Think how difficult, moreover, it was for military court-martials. Not shocking here, the court ultimately decided that Rogers was not guilty. But this is what was astonishing and was apparently lost on members of the 140th Pennsylvania as well as the court-martial, was the incriminating nature of the testimony against the entire regiment. A number of witnesses took the stand and confessed to seeing scores of their comrades hiding behind rocks. The very reason the charges of cowardice were leveled against Rogers. William Partey, the adjutant of the regiment, observed, I ordered some enlisted men from behind a large rock where they had taken shelter. Private John Mitchell of the 140th, when he was asked about where he was captured, Mitchell answered very candidly. He said, I was behind a rock. Why the inconsistency as to who was charged with cowardice? Scores of men of the 140th Pennsylvania were excused for their questionable behavior, but Rogers was singled out for a crime that was widely committed. Now, possibly there were different standards of courage held for officers as well as enlisted men. Maybe there was a conspiracy against Rogers, right, as he had alleged, or quite possibly what was developing right here at Gettysburg was a more flexible and pragmatic view of courage and cowardice. The early war definitions and expectations were losing their rigidness. Over time, veterans, they're tempering their views. Any man who stood on the firing line, even if he wavered in the midst of battle, compared favorably with those laggards who fell by the wayside because of sore feet, rheumatism, diarrhea, or some other ailment. By Gettysburg, veterans came to recognize that soldiers rarely behaved in any consistent way under fire. At one moment, a soldier was a dependable fighter, and then, an instant later, that same man was shaky, hesitant, and desperate to disappear from the front. a veteran of the 83rd Pennsylvania, and of course, it's always obligatory here at Gettysburg to make a 20th Maine reference. Here it goes. The 83rd Pennsylvania, as you know, was to the right of the 20th Maine. Amos Judson. It's a fantastic regimental that he published in 1865, so right after the war. This is what Amos Judson wrote about this new perception or standard of courage and cowardice. I have seen men fight well one day and give evidence of timidity the next, but these fluctuations in his courage are merely temporary. As men came to appreciate that courage did not come from a bottomless well, some men showed more sympathy for a comrade who wavered in battle. And in some cases, this sympathy even extended to men whose actions were indisputably cowardly. During the preparations for Pickett's charge, Confederate artillerist Edward Porter Alexander. I rave about this book. Those of you who've heard me speak before, it is by far the finest account we have from any member of Lee's Army. That book called Fighting for the Confederacy. Edward Porter Alexander was responsible for the artillery under James Longstreet's command on July the 3rd. I'll say it again. I didn't see many hands move. I see one of my students all the way in the back there. He can attest to this. I beg my students, when I say a book title, move your hand like you're actually writing down the title, right? You're going to read it later. Okay, so here we go again. Ready? Fighting for the Confederacy. Edward Porter Alexander. There is nothing like it. It is just a fantastic account of a man who was writing about the war from Nicaragua and writing for only his family's consumption. It is an account that has a freshness, an honesty to it that you won't find in most post-war memoirs. So, during the preparations of Pickett's charge, Alexander, he spots two Mississippi lieutenants apparently robbing the dead body of a Confederate officer lying in the road. Alexander rode over to them. He's going to reproach them. And this is what the lieutenant said. He's not dead. Damn him, he's drunk. It is our surgeon, and he is drunk too of whiskey issued for the wounded. And it's not the first time either. We are just taking his medical instruments to take care of the wounded. Alexander told them, toss him about, roll him, shake him, see if you can't arouse him. The drunken soldier did not stir. Alexander then took down the names of all three men, and when they returned to Virginia, he pressed charges against the doctor. Trial took place the following spring of 1864, and during the interlude, some of the friends of the doctor, they got to the lieutenants. They convinced the lieutenants to testify that the physician was not drunk, but under the influence of opium, which I'm not sure what that says. You can't get drunk in the Army of Northern Virginia, but you can get stoned on opium and get off. But that's exactly what happened here, because the court was divided, the doctor was acquitted, and of course this is no shock here. Look, it's his doctor's friends that were able to get him off. But this is what is surprising, is Alexander's reaction to the verdict. I am very grateful for the result, he wrote after the war, because I had perhaps too much youthful indignation at a crime to which I never had any personal inclination, and I made the charges too severe. Now, Alexander's post-war regret was not just the musings of an older and wiser man who had found the liberating spirit of moderation. His self-criticism also suggests that some came to question the very basis of cowardice, or at least to sympathize with those who were broken down in battle. But as you can imagine, there were limits to empathy, and that boundary, as I keep stressing here, it was very fluid, but that boundary still had many sentinels. Established medical knowledge was a guard post, manned not just by doctors, but by soldiers and officers alike. This is a critical point, because we're going to probably, I hope we'll talk about post-traumatic stress disorder. Right? Look, they had very different ideas about how the body and the mind and emotions function. And we want to apply post-traumatic stress disorder to anyone now. And when we talk about this in our conversation after my talk, this is something to come back to, because soldiers at the time, they agreed that legitimate battlefield injuries were always detectable, that they would always leave a visible trace in the body. But as the war progressed, Civil War soldiers started to get confused. They couldn't understand, why is a man who has a spotless battlefield record suddenly what? Break down and leave the army. What's unfortunate is that few raised the possibility that they maybe didn't really understand the impact of combat on the mind and body. So the result was the vast majority of Civil War Americans lacked the critical angle to question popular understandings of cowardice. This was largely because they never relinquished the following core belief. Unless a bullet shattered a bone or a shell fragment shredded flesh, officers and enlisted men almost always suspected that a man without a visible bodily injury was likely a malingerer. So having almost no understanding of the physical causes behind mental health issues, it is likely that many of these so-called cowards were actually suffering lingering effects of battle. Again, I'm going to caution us. We should not use a sweeping diagnosis of battle fatigue to explain why some men ran in battle. But from our perspective, it's clear. Civil War Americans were suffering from medical night blindness because they could never make that connection between body and mind. Let me give you one example. From the Confederate Medical Manual, Confederate surgeon Julian Chisholm, this is what he wrote. And again, this is a typical perspective on both sides. He wrote that possible for there to be invisible physical or mental scars from battle. Possible. Being stunned by a bomb, he wrote, is a piece of good fortune to many who prefer hospital life to the exposures and privations of field. And as long as the war lasts, there will be some who will have partially paralyzed limbs and painful spines from this cause. To be stung by a bung, that's the words of the soldiers, to be stung by a bung and to be demoralized is a condition which hospital surgeons classify among the most intractable of diseases. Chisholm, he might seem callous to us, but in defense of these surgeons, we have to remember that many soldiers went to great lengths to escape battle or to feign an illness. In one Union regiment, there was a soldier who was supposedly mentally ill. His regiment watched him closely, and what he would do is this. For hours in camp, he would sit alone with a pole and imagine himself fishing. Finally, he was discharged for his behavior. As he was leaving his regiment, one of his comrades yelled at him, "Bill, what did you make such a damn fool of yourself as to sit out in the sun all day pretending to be fishing?" The soldier pulled out his discharge papers and replied, "I was fishing for these papers." Attempts to feign illness verified the popular belief that extreme terror was incapable of delivering a physical blow to the body. Trouble sleeping, depression, excitability, general irritability, erratic heart rate, shaky memory, throbbing headaches, a loss of hearing, diminishment of arm and leg strength. These were common complaints of combat veterans to this day. Yet their ailments were typically dismissed as inventions of the mind rather than ruptures of the body. And what is telling is the way that medical and military officials always worked from the assumption that battlefield injuries were detectable. This imperfect knowledge of trauma was reinforced by a military system of discipline that, as you can guess it, what do they want above all else? They want bodies at the front. To make sure this happens, that medical knowledge, it was implemented with often brute force. This is, I think, one of the more shocking aspects of my talk, something that I encountered in my research for my book. These tactics, treatments of Civil War surgeons that I'm about to describe to you, I am not suggesting that every surgeon handled his patient in this way, but what I want you to remember, that the fact that this did happen, and the account I'm about to read to you, published in a medical journal, that there is an awareness, a pervasive awareness, that if in fact you are a malingerer, that you could face torture torture from physicians who were trying to either diagnose your ailment or, better yet, what? Get a confession that you're a malingerer. These three men were hardly alone. They're Northern surgeons William Keene, S. Weir Mitchell, and George Morehouse. They were some of the most outspoken advocates of using bodily pains to cure cowardice. Again, this isn't a published journal. They tortured a Pennsylvania soldier who was suffering from bodily paralysis. The doctors, they wrote that they were baffled by his, and I'm quoting them now, his facial gymnastics. But they still suspected him of malingering, and they targeted him for intense testing and examination. To gauge the sensitivity of his skin, the doctors touched the soldier's cheek with a pencil while he closed his eyes. Upon saying that he felt nothing, the surgeons responded by suddenly thrusting a needle into his face. The soldier again said that he felt nothing, and the attending doctors, despite noticing that the man did not wince, they still thought he was putting on an act. They proceeded to powder his face with flour before applying to his face electric brushes attached to a powerful battery. As the current entered the man's body, he slumped forward in his chair, his hands gripping his seat, his feet digging into the ground as he braced himself against the pain. The doctors, they noticed that he was, to use their words, secretly gritting his teeth and that his face was covered with sweat. But the patient insisted that he was numb to the electrical charges. A remark that the doctors thought was said with amusing nonchalance. As soon as the session ended, the soldier said, no surprise here, he said, "I'm cured. I'm free of the disease." But the doctors, they weren't finished with him. They thought it would serve him well if they were to, quote, work a little on his imagination. They proceeded to turn him over and inspect his spine, telling him that there was a tender spot on his back that was generally found among patients who suffered from the same problem. They then reported that the soldier nearly fainted from the pressure when they started to poke his back. But before the pain overtook the soldier, he broke free from the attendants, ran away from them, and of course then reported to duty the next day. When he went back to his regiment, they put in the descriptive list next to his name, malingerer. That's with him for the rest of his life, right, in the military. But what the doctors did not acknowledge in that notation, by their own admission, they had said that this man exhibited a curious physiological contradiction that had resulted in his paralysis. That's nowhere to be found. So curing the patient in this and in other instances was of secondary consideration to the overriding imperative of exposing his deception and, of course, restoring discipline. I want to add, how many doctors use these kind of tactics is difficult to say. And we should all, of course, remind ourselves that that stereotype of the Civil War surgeon as a butcher who's hacksawing his way away is absolutely false. And I certainly don't want to resurrect that. But I want to remind you of this. The tactics employed by Confederate surgeon Chisholm, he recommended, ready? Cauterization. It's burning of the skin. Reluctant Confederate soldiers. Bucking a man who had supposedly lost his voice. Reducing the food intake for a man who claimed that he was suffering night blindness. And squirting turpentine in the eye of a man to see if he were actually suffering an epileptic fit. These techniques of rebuilding soldiers through pain, of course, were far from effectual. I'll just give you one account from a Union soldier, a USCT, African American. He, of course, was so appalled by the treatment that he was receiving, he wrote to the government, "If a man says he's sick, it is the doctor's privilege to say yes or no. And if you can't work, you are sent to the guardhouse. Bucked, gagged, and stay so till they see fit to relieve you. Now, do you call this equality? If so, God help such equality." Now, for many of these men who did return to the ranks, there's some real exceptional cases of self-mutilation. On the eve of the 1864 Overland Campaign, a veteran of Lee's army left Chimborazo Hospital. He then deliberately placed his left hand on the tracks of the York River Railroad, his fingers crushed by the driving wheels of the engine. We need to just remind ourselves, and Dr. McPherson was on my dissertation committee. I think the world of him. His work in restoring ideas as a powerful force among Civil War soldiers is compelling, it's persuasive, but we need to remind ourselves that these men, when they were put into the ranks, that they were constrained, that they had limited choices, and that they faced violence on all fronts. In fact, Sam Watkins from the Army of Tennessee, who wrote a very famous memoir, he remembered, when we were drawn up in line of battle, a detail of 1/10 of the army was placed in our rear to shoot us down if we ran. No pack of hounds under a master's lash or a body of penitentiary convicts were ever under a greater surveillance. So we can see brute force, and we need to remind ourselves of this. I'll go back to the 20th Maine, but if I recall correctly, the left flank of the 20th Maine were held in place by a lieutenant who had his saber out, keeping men fixed in their positions. If the point of the sword wasn't enough, we all know that the pen was extraordinarily mighty in ruining men's reputations. A letter home from a soldier acknowledging, or I should say charging, a comrade with cowardice would doom that soldier. But men were very reluctant to, in essence, rat out their comrades. But it still was a constant pressure. Let me just give you one example of a North Carolina soldier who thought war was a perversity against God, but he shied away from calling out individual soldiers to his wife. He still wanted her to know, though, that men were terrified in battle. He had seen at Chancellorsville one of his comrades who had defecated in his pants. I have noticed him very closely since the fight, and I perceive that his pants is a little stained, but I think that he has washed them since the battle. Don't let nobody see this. Don't let nobody see this. So this stigma of being labeled a coward, it was a terrifying prospect to any soldier. But what is striking, folks, is that the word coward is rarely used. They came up with euphemisms. Those euphemisms: shirker, skedaddler, malingerer, skulker. And I would suggest that reveals a growing pragmatism amongst men who, again, had a more flexible view of courage and cowardice. But these labels, even these euphemisms, they, of course, possess the power to strip a man of his cherished reputation. And that brings us back to the 14th Indiana's William Nixon. He wrote a lengthy appeal in his defense, pleading with the court that he be allowed to accompany his regiment in the next action. No punishment from the court, he said, would be more severely felt than being kept off the field of battle. It would lose me the chance of proving to my friends at home, he wrote, that I was not a coward and that I am not so now. The court found Nixon guilty of misbehavior in front of the enemy. The punishment? 7 months of pay forfeited. Now, we'll never know if Nixon was relieved by the verdict or if his sense of self-worth was crushed. But from his case and the experience of others, we do know that the judgment of cowardice was highly subjective, that it was leveled by a military establishment that could never have enough disciplined bodies, and that cultural ideas, these medical ideas, perceived as established truths, sanctioned medical torture against so-called malingerers. Now, rather than finger wag at the past for its benighted cruelties, we should remind ourselves that we, like all people, are also entrapped by the very knowledge that supposedly liberates us. Part of the imprisonment comes from the inescapable past. Are we not the intellectual heirs of a Civil War belief that will behavior and character should trump fear? Why is it that some people label the 11th Corps as cowards, but refuse to hold elements of Pickett and Pettigrew's men culpable for the same crime? And why is it that when we tour battlefields that we find the charge so alluring, forgetting that those massive boulders at Gettysburg are not just platforms for our statues today, but they were hiding places for terrified soldiers. The questions we ask and the stories we tell, they say a great deal about these deeply held values that help us appreciate and understand how we want to see ourselves as Americans at war. Contemplation, not quick answers, is in order, especially during this commemorative period. And we should also pause before leveling the judgment of cowardice against a Civil War soldier whose mental state is as unknown to us as it was misunderstood by contemporaries. As confused as Civil War Americans were about how combat affected a man's mind and body, the veterans themselves gradually recognized that will behavior had its limits, that the body could stand only so much before morale wavered, spirits sank, and the mind cracked. Survivors of Civil War combat who could never agree on where they attacked or how far they advanced could agree on one point, that every man deep inside of him was born to run. Thank you. We still do about 5 minutes or so? Yeah, sure. We have time for questions, comments. Again, I welcome any disagreements, challenges you might have.
How would you label an individual who got a substitute to fight in the war for that person if they live close to the Mason-Dixon line?
Question is about how you would label this person. You again get into that murky world of who's determined or deemed coward and who's determined or deemed brave. Obviously, procedurally, legally, one could do that, and certainly wouldn't come under any kind of military or government kind of action, right? Because they were able to provide someone or to get someone to serve in their place. But the community pressure would be overwhelming. There is a great set of letters, so get your pen out here. Ready? No Freedom Shrieker. No Freedom Shrieker. The letters of Charles Biddlecombe from New York. This is a man who served in 1861. He came back home. He re-enlisted in 64. He got a little bit of a bounty. The idea of getting a substitute crossed his mind. The reason why he did not do it, because the community pressure and family pressure was so great that he did not want to have that label of being seen as a malingerer or as a coward. It is a fabulous set of letters, and it captures, and here again, folks, I would say, especially during this 150th time, we need to remind ourselves that the heroic narratives is what appeal to us. It's seductive, and what we have to return to is how ambivalent these men were about what they had gone through. Biddlecombe, end of 1864 campaign, he wrote his family and said, I would love to have my uniform stuffed like a straw man in my office. And when I have a bad day on the farm, I can look at that man and say, you know what? Life's not so bad. I can remember how rough it was to be a soldier in the Army of the Potomac. 2 weeks after that, Biddlecombe gets a new coat. He has to give up his old one. He writes his wife and says, this coat is stained with the soil of wilderness, Spotsylvania, North Anna, Cold Harbor. This coat symbolizes, embodies the sacrifices, the loss of all my comrades. If I could only send this coat home to be a relic in my personal museum. That conflicted nature of combat is something that we badly need to restore when we think about how these men came to terms with the horror of battle. Any questions? We got one more? Yeah, one more.
3 words come to mind that from your talk that are sticking with me. Trauma, misunderstanding, and stigma. These are actually very much in play now as we think about post-traumatic stress disorder for veterans coming home from our foreign wars currently, as it is indeed for the whole realm of serious and persistent mental illness that many suffer. It would be very interesting as to weave into your work how trauma affects the psychology and the mind of these soldiers. It doesn't take anything away from their valor.
That's right.
But it definitely you persuaded me that this can help us to reshape the way, a holistic concept of what these soldiers went through and what the experience meant to them.
I'll be focused with this response here. It's a very good observation. Again, keep in mind that their understanding of trauma is so different from ours today. So, for example, we know that the concussion of a shell, it can literally leave lesions on your nerves, right? And it could, of course, obviously inhibit your mental health or your behavior. They have absolutely no sense of that at all. At all. So there are a few surgeons who, in fact, write in their journals, this basically doesn't make sense. We have a soldier whose case study reveals consistent, dependable behavior in combat, and then suddenly he, in essence, snaps. But there's never a sense that just maybe that explosion of the shell has actually affected the body itself. What do they ultimately fall back on? They say it's a breakdown in character. A breakdown in character. Post-traumatic stress disorder, it has become way too loosely used. I believe, although I'm hardly an expert on this, we need to remind ourselves that a soldier who has a memory of traumatic origins, right, that it resurfaces in an uncontrollable way, you can't control it, and that, of course, then shapes behavior in what we would deem to be dysfunctional. Civil War soldiers don't talk and write about their subconscious in that way. Now, that doesn't mean that that didn't happen, but it is very hard to penetrate source material in which they're coming to grips with those memories. All these surgeons that I've mentioned, you look at the case studies, and I have not come across a single surgeon who ever inquired about what happened out in the field. What did you see? How is this possibly filtering or figuring into your actions today? And then the final point, and it is a critical one. Ideas about trauma, about pain, and about suffering are culturally constructed. They lived in a much different world than what we did. And their belief was, through suffering, that's where a man finds his true self. And so their attitude toward how the survivors came to terms with this, the expectation is wildly different from what we believe today. Good? Thank you so much.